A new US president is elected.
I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president.
The winner waits months after the election to take the reins, but in the meantime...
Literally, you go in the morning and you come out extremely late at night every single day of the week between the election and the inauguration.
A crash course on classified secrets, nuclear codes, and White House living.
I am not frightened by what lies ahead.
There's a period of real vulnerability for the United States because the government really has been decapitated.
All the while, the outgoing president still holds the power.
It takes two to tango. We've seen, unfortunately, instances of, bad cooperation.
So how do you go from a candidate to commander-in-chief in just 76 days?
Given a chance to do it again, I'd have said, you bet.
I cannot imagine a greater honor or a more interesting job.
It's a tough job, but I've had a lot of tough jobs.
It's one of the most important jobs in the world, a position 47 presidents have held since George Washington in 1789. So it's no surprise that changing from one to the next is no walk in the park.
We're talking about the largest, most complex takeover of any organization, I would say not just in the United States, but in the world in terms of size and consequence.
Imagine if you were acquiring the largest company on earth and you had to learn everything about it.
Usually the cost is anywhere from, in sort of rough numbers, $10 to $20 million.
Unlike the UK, where the handover of power takes less than 24 hours, the US presidential transition spans about 2.5 months, and those vying for a seat in the Oval Office often start planning long before Election Day.
So it's really a preparation process of saying, okay, how can we make sure that on day one, on January 20th, everything is ready to go without any interruptions.
In 1963, the Presidential Transition Act came into place to formalise that transition of power. But a lot of what happens is based on norms and traditions rather than legislation.
You can create all the rules you want, but if you don't have leaders who understand their fundamental responsibility, there's always going to be gaps in the system. And we're seeing that this cycle as well.
My wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby.
This will be an open administration, open to new ideas, open to men and women of both parties.
This will truly be the golden age of America. That's what we have to have.
We knew early in the evening, fairly early in the evening, that President-elect Obama was going to be inaugurated on January the 20th. And it was one of the most exciting evenings of my life. One, because we had all been working so hard on the campaign to try and ensure his election. It was obviously an historic night, the election of the first African-American to the presidency in the United States. And the streets in Washington were just electric. I remember literally just seeing people running up and down the street. Horns were honking, people were at the White House gates chanting. And so we enjoyed that evening, and as you can imagine, got home fairly late.
In 2008, presidential candidate Barack Obama beat John McCain in a decisive victory. It was a clear-cut win, but elections aren't always so easy to call.
America's waking up only to learn that we still don't know for sure who the next president will be.
Election night was one of the most surreal events that most of us involved in politics could possibly have experienced.
Turn the lights down, the party just got wilder. Florida comes out of the Gore column, back up in the air. This doesn't mean that Bush doesn't carry Florida. What it means is big trouble down there with data and computers in Florida.
The Secretary of State of Florida had ultimately declared Bush the winner by just 537 votes out of millions cast.
Because of the very close election, there was a recount in Florida, and so we couldn't determine who the next U.S. president would be. And we didn't figure that out until basically the Supreme Court ruled in December of that year.
Our country has been through a long and trying period, with the outcome of the presidential election not finalized for longer than any of us could ever imagine.
The Bush transition into the presidency was basically cut in half. It's normally 70 days. Bush had half of that.
When you think about what happens after Election Day, it depends on how clear it is that there is in fact a winner.
In the US, there's an official federal agency who are responsible for recognizing the winner, the General Services Administration, otherwise known as the GSA.
They free up funds that Congress has allocated to help with the transition process. They provide office space. They help with things like emails and other logistics. They're sort of, again, the executive assistant of the transition process to make sure everything is going smoothly.
After the 2020 election, when there was a delay in recognizing who actually appeared to have won the election, the Biden-Harris team was left with 3 weeks of not being able to have access to agencies, to information that they needed in order to prepare for taking over the U.S. government. The law was changed by the Congress to now, if there's no clear winner, that both candidates will have access to all the information that they need.
President Trump is deepening the threat of a constitutional crisis after the November election. He has refused to promise that he'll leave office peacefully if defeated.
There can also be a snag if the current Oval Office occupier doesn't want to budge.
They're trying to steal an election. They're trying to rig an election, and we can't let that happen.
So it's the proverbial takes two to tango. We've seen, unfortunately, instances of, bad cooperation, and the worst example of that, frankly, was in 2020.
His legal team was challenging the election results, even though he failed repeatedly in court, and that ultimately delayed the transition for President Biden. They weren't able to access the funds or receive sort of the intelligence briefings that an incoming president would normally receive.
If you have an uncooperative administration sitting in those seats at that moment, you run into a real problem.
As a democracy, the ability to hand over power to a new leader who represents the will of the people at that time, is fundamental.
So once you've cleared all those obstacles, which can take days, weeks, months, congratulations, you're the president-elect. Time to get to work. After a winner's called, the president-elect can expect to receive worldwide congratulations on their victory.
Usually with the president-elect, we'll get some congratulation calls from other world leaders. Typically, the U.S. tends to start with their neighbors, so Canada's usually first on that list. And then it's usually our NATO allies, European allies, the UK, and also our allies in Asia, and kind of talking to our friends first, and then kind of moving out from there to different world leaders who the U.S. might have partnerships with, but maybe not the closest of relationships.
This is actually a very tricky issue. On one hand, the period between the election and the inauguration is very short when you think about the size of the task. On the other hand, it can also feel kind of long for those folks that are trying to engage with the incoming president-elect, because in our system, we always have only one president.
Two presidents, one country can be difficult to navigate. The outgoing president might be halfway out the door, but their job isn't over just yet.
It's actually rare for a one-term president to happen. Usually you have a president who served 2 terms and they're, leaving the office. It's not a time for presidents to do big, ambitious projects, but it is a time to maybe do some things on the agenda that might not have been so politically popular, but is sort of a lasting legacy thing that they might want to do before they head out the door.
So over the next 75 days, all of us must ensure that the next president and his team can hit the ground running.
We were very fortunate in 2008, 2009. The George W. Bush administration made it a hallmark of their final days that they were going to cooperate with us.
At that time, I was President Bush's chief of staff, and he called me in early summer and said that the upcoming transition is the first one in modern history where the homeland of the United States is actually under threat. And therefore, he wanted it to be the most cooperative transition in the history of the United States.
It's a very, very intense period of time, and it starts immediately. The day after the election, most of the team mistakenly thought that they were going to be able to go on vacation, at least for a little bit. I mean, they'd been working day in, day out, 24/7 for literally almost 2 years. And they got a call that said, you know that vacation you planned? You're going to have to cancel that because you need to get to Washington quickly.
From a transition perspective, it is really job number one, is trying to move the personnel operation as quickly as you possibly can.
When the country changes leaders, the government doesn't stop. In a matter of months, a new president will be responsible for 456 federal agencies, from the Departments of Agriculture to the Justice Department to NASA.
In the U.S. system, unlike parliamentary system, it is not just the very top of the government that is decapitated in a change of power. It's the top goes very far down.
There are, over 2 million civilian federal employees. There are 4,000 of them that are political appointees.
It's a incredibly disruptive aspect of the American transition where you have so many leaders that are turning over. It is complicated by the fact that the top 1,300 of those leaders require Senate confirmation.
The Senate is a group of 100 elected officials of all political colours, and in this process they vet the president's nominations for the jobs and hold public hearings to ask questions. Then senators vote, and if the majority agrees, the nominee bags the job.
You are identifying people who are going to hold seats like Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Secretary of the Treasury, and other department leaders and agency leaders.
You're looking at almost 200-day averages for confirmation, which means that you have, long-standing vacancies in senior positions, and then individuals who finally, if they get confirmed, are usually around for no more than 2 years. So you have a constant rotating cast of characters.
Literally, you go in the morning and you come out extremely late at night, and that happens every single day of the week between the election and the inauguration.
One of the perks of the job is residing at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Whilst the president-elect doesn't move in until January 20th, it's tradition that during the transition period, the outgoing president will host them for a visit.
This is not anything legal, but it is kind of a norm that we have practiced, and again, it represents the peaceful transfer of power. The idea is to send this message that we've had this really brutal presidential campaign and we've made it very clear what our political differences are, but the most important thing is that we accept who the winner is regardless of their political party, and now we're going to come together and give our support to the new president for the interest of the American people.
I have been very encouraged by the, interest in President-elect Trump's wanting to work with my team.
I very much look forward to dealing with the president in the future.
The incoming president has a budget of $100,000 to redecorate parts of the White House. The mansion, spanning 6 floors and 132 rooms, has seen a lot of changes throughout the years. But the first visit before Inauguration Day can bring mixed emotions for both sides.
It is a very personal moment for the president-elect and, in this case, his family, the new First Lady, their 2 children, as well as others who are moving to Washington, D.C., some of them for the first time.
I do remember the day when the Obamas came, were given a tour by Mrs. Bush through the residence. which in a matter of weeks would be their residence. It felt to me a little bit awkward. Imagine if you're in the home you've lived in for 8 years with, with the people that have served you, and then all of a sudden in a couple of weeks somebody is taken over that home. But I think it's a very nice part of our traditions.
As soon as possible after the election, it's a legal requirement that the president-elect is briefed on any major threats to national security or covert military operations.
The U.S. is a massive government, and it faces a lot of challenges and threats, so making sure that the president-elect is being briefed and has access to the intelligence to know what threats America faces, and to make sure that he has the tools to have his team in place and ready again to start on day one.
In 2000, as the disputed election rumbled on, the incoming president, George W. Bush, faced delay in appointing his primary security staff.
President Bill Clinton gave George W. Bush access to intelligence to try to smooth that transition, but ultimately the Bush team was delayed from getting their people in place, and soon after he took office, of course, 9/11 happened, this massive terrorist attack on U.S. soil.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
I was in the White House on 9/11. I was at that time the Deputy Chief of Staff in the White House. What I saw was a government that was not well prepared to handle a terrorist attack. How much of that is due to the truncated transition we had? It's hard to say. We didn't have as many national security senior leaders in place as we could have had we had a full transition.
The 9/11 Commission, which was sort of the most important summary of what happened for our country and why, highlighted the fact that for President Bush, the fact that he had not had his top national security team in place or in place for very long was an important contributing factor to what occurred in our country. Post 9/11, there has been a recognition that we live in a very dangerous world and that understanding those dangers is a fundamental responsibility of the leadership of the United States government.
The first weeks after the installation of a new president is a period of real vulnerability for the United States.
Inauguration Day, even as I just say that, I literally get chills thinking about that day. It was a beautiful, sunny, but very, very cold day. And yet there were millions of people who were in Washington, D.C. and gathered to watch the inauguration take place on the steps of the Capitol.
After months of campaigning and about 76 days of transitioning, your official day one begins, usually with lunch with the former post holder, before you hitch a ride to the Capitol together.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
Immediately, the president now has all the power and authority that comes with that office.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
The president will give their inauguration address, which is usually the sort of symbolic marker of how they see their presidency. It's really just a way for a president to reintroduce himself as the president, not as a presidential candidate.
And who could forget about the music? Behind the scenes, as the new president swears the oath, there will be the handover of the nuclear football. This is a briefcase containing the all-important nuclear codes in case of an emergency.
The military aide who has the football is, before noon, is prepared to respond with the current president, and at the strike of noon, the military aide is prepared to respond with the new president.
And back at the White House, a team of 90-plus staff, from carpenters to curators, spring into action to flip the house for the new president.
The White House staff completely turns over the residence in the period of time during the inauguration and the lunch that follows, so that when they walk into the residence, their things are there and they can immediately start to live in the White House.
Just as a logistical matter, it is incredible to watch, one moment one team is there and the next moment an entirely new team is there. And it's not just the computers change over, everything changes over.
I did it my way.
Of course, later in the day, there's the big celebration, the big inauguration ball, which is an opportunity for the president and all of the people that helped get him elected in his campaign and his incoming administration to celebrate before the hard work begins.
When I walked into my office in the West Wing, got my security pass, walked in the office, and my phone was ringing. It wasn't, "Hi, Melody, congratulations." It was a substantive question, and that's always stayed with me. And it does remind me that the government never rests, it never sleeps, and the continuity of government and the peaceful transfer of power is absolutely essential.
You can have proximity to the most powerful person in the world in the morning, and then by operation of democracy in the afternoon, you're just an ordinary citizen who has to take his shoes off in the security line at the airport.